The show will begin in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you thought you just heard a window break, don't worry. It's just fragments of silicon.
Welcome to another installment of Fragments of Silicon, the European edition. Joining us this week is Julian Gollop of Snapshot Games.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. This is an interview we've been wanting to do for a while, but had some complications.
Yes, I do apologize for that. My entire family being ill in sequential order.
Think nothing of it. Kind of dealing with something quite the same at the moment.
That's kind of how families work anyway.
Yeah.
Tis the season to be sick now.
What is it? The family that gets sick together sticks together?
Even, whatever mantra you want to go with. It's like it's the sixth season, so sometimes that arises. Anyway, so we like to get started by asking our interviewees how they got started in video games, both on a personal level and a professional level.
Okay. Shall I start?
Yes.
Okay. How I got interested in games. Now, do you mean board games, role-playing games, or video games, or everything? Is the question. Because when I started getting interested in games, video games didn't exist. So we're going back a ways. I mean, I was into board games, especially Hex Encounter war games from SBI Avalon Hill, and then, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. This was around 1980. Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had just come out. I got into science fiction role-playing games as well. Traveller was one, and I think the first video games I played were in the arcades, of course. I mean, I remember old favorites of mine were things like Defender and Robotron, Missile Command, Asteroids. I think those were the main ones. But what I really wanted to do was implement my sort of strategy games ideas on home computers. So I started as soon as home computers were viable, I started both playing and programming them. So the first machine I had, actually, it was really a viable sort of video game system, if you can call it that, was the Sinclair ZX81 with a 16K RAM pack, and which they had classic games on that, including Monster Maze and chess and you name it. So that's where I started from.
Yeah, that's going back a ways.
It is going back a way, yeah. Sorry, it's a long time ago.
No, like we have that happen occasionally. It's like some people started earlier, some people started later. It's like it's just we don't hear a lot about the ZX81. Like usually it's like the ZX Spectrum.
Yes, well, that was obviously my second machine that I acquired after learning to program a bit on the ZX81, and the Spectrum was amazingly successful in the UK. I think that was about it, and it was relatively cheap for the amount of memory you got. This is a very important factor, by the way, when it comes to actually trying to build the games that I wanted to build, which were relatively sophisticated strategy games with AIs, and so the Spectrum 48K had a massive 48K of RAM, which may not sound like a lot these days, of course, but in those days it was amazing.
I'm like, everything is relative. It's like yesterday's 48K of RAM is today's, I don't know, 2 terabytes.
Yeah.
Or 16 gigs in terms of RAM or whatever spec you want to use. I mean, obviously, size has changed, but the principle remains the same.
Yeah, I know. Sort of 48K is probably not enough for an icon on your desktop these days, because the programming was much more limited, and the tools available were much more limited. So I was programming in Z80 assembler, which is a very limited instruction set. It made it difficult to do things, but you had to program really close to the hardware. So literally, to put something on a screen, you had to actually shift bytes and bits into an area of memory, which is the screen memory, and that's it. That's all you can do.
I'm like, and how restrictive was that in regards to making the games you wanted to make?
It was tricky. I think the trickiest thing that I had to deal with actually was artificial intelligence. So the first game that I programmed on the ZX Spectrum was a game called Nebula. And interestingly, this could be seen as a very, very early version of a 4X game, because you were basically in command of like a star empire. You had to explore and expand and exploit and do the usual 4X stuff. And single player, that was intended as a multiplayer version of a game. The single player game had a sort of random event, which was this enemy that invaded the galaxy, which is cool. That was relatively easy to do on that particular game because it was pretty dumb. But as soon as I got into something more sophisticated, so my next game I programmed was a game called Rebel Star Raiders. This was a 2-player tactical squad game, and here is actually the very origin of XCOM. And it had different squad members with different names and different weapons and ranged combat and sort of terrain that obstructed fire and so on. So it had all that, but it was only 2 players. I hadn't figured out how to do AI at all at that stage. And interesting enough, that sold quite well. Of course, you'll never be able to sell just a 2-player game on a console these days. But it did quite well. And the problem they were doing in AI, which I did manage to do with my next game, which is called Chaos, which came out in 1985, is that I had, you stuff your code, your 40K that you've got for your code and data with code and graphics, and then you've got like 3K left or something to actually code the AI in, and that's pretty tricky. So yeah, that was a challenge.
No doubt, no doubt. Now, did you do all of your early programming on the Sinclair platforms, or did you ever manage to do anything on the Commodore 64? Or other
Yeah, we did. Yes. So by the time we got to a game called Laser Squad, so I set up a company. This time was in 1988, and my brother came to work with me, fresh out of college. He was actually going to implement the Commodore 64 version, but I'd already started on it, so we'd already. The original was made on the Sinclair 48K, original version of Laser Squad. I started the Commodore 64 version. My brother finished that, and that's also a very cool machine. It was way more expensive than the ZX Spectrum, but it had a lot more hardware. Of course, it had like a decent sound chip. On a ZX Spectrum, you had basically a speaker that you could basically turn on and off. It had better video hardware. You had hardware sprites as well. It was complicated to manage the memory in that machine, I seem to remember. And it had a disk drive that really sucked. The disk drive was about as slow to load and save stuff as it was to load and save stuff on a simple tape drive on the ZX Spectrum. So yeah, we did Commodore 64 version of Laser Squad, so that was back in '88. And also another machine we made the game for was the Amstrad CPC. Those were all the 8-bit machines.
Right.
And then there was a an Atari ST and Amiga version made of Laser Squad, but we didn't do that version. That was done by another company. That was done a conversion that was done by somebody else.
I suppose the question that beckons is, when did you finally graduate to the 16-bit machines?
Yeah, it's around 89, I think. Immediately we finished Laser Squad on the 8-bit machines. We started on my next game, which is called Lords of Chaos. But that was made for all the home computer platforms that we could sort of manage. So that was made for the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC, Commodore Amiga, and Atari ST. That was quite a big effort. I don't think we ever did such a cross-platform effort after that again. But that, the 8-bit machines were sort of dying by that stage. And interestingly, though, we didn't really dwell much on the Amiga and ST in particular, because we wanted to go for the PC. We saw the PC as the gaming machine of the future, especially for strategy games. Which we were correct, by the way, because so we're going back to like 1990. And the games that were coming out then were, well, from Microprose, we had Railroad Tycoon. And then not long after that was Civilization, of course. I think Civilization was 91, if I remember correctly, something like that. So we were very keen to get into doing stuff on the PC at that stage.
Yeah, and this is about the time the PC is really taking off.
Yeah.
It's like everything from, say, the side-scrolling platformers to FPSs.
Yeah, that's right. Of course, I remember seeing for the first time Wolfenstein 3D. That blew me away. That was amazing. And that was on the PC.
So I suppose the question is, when did you start developing XCOM?
XCOM started initially with a demo that we made on the Atari ST. So we decided we wanted to start working on PC games, strategy games, and we wanted to find a decent publisher. Top of our list was Microprose, because we were already, really enamored with Sid Meier. Sid Meier was a big influence on both me and my brother. And so we made a demo on the ST. We took it to Microprose, made it clear that we wanted to do it on the PC. And that was absolutely fine with them, because Microprose were primarily developing stuff on the PC in the US at that stage, and the UK division of Microprose wanted to do the same kind of stuff that the US division was doing. So they asked us if we were capable of doing it. Of course, we said absolutely, of course, no problem, easy peasy. And we never even programmed anything on the PC at that stage. But we kind of guessed it would be easier than doing assembly language stuff on the 8-bit machines. And we were right, or at least partially right, because one thing you have to remember about the PCs in those days is that hardware standards were difficult, and especially when it came to expanded memory, because the PC as a base machine only had 640K, and that was the PC specification. Anything beyond that, different manufacturers and stuff were doing different things. So you had extended memory and expanded memory, and these were all sort of like page swapping systems. You have to page in memory to address it. It was a nightmare. Unfortunately, we came across a really fantastic compiler called a Whatcom C compiler, which treated the memory as a flat memory model, so we could build stuff very easily. That basically saved our bacon from some real stress. And it actually made it actually Whatcom C probably is the single most important piece of software that made PC gaming viable, because it solved that really difficult hardware problem with how to treat the extended memory. So that was cool. We were away. We started on XCOM, and it started as a demo for Laser Squad 2. So all we had at that stage was basically an evolution of our tactical battle system only. And there are a lot of the elements of the tactical system for XCOM were there. You know, we had action points, different types of shots, morale systems, stamina systems, armor systems. It had 3D isometric graphics again. Bullets can go up and down as well as left and right. So it had all of that stuff there. It just didn't have any of the strategy layer. And that came about really because of our interaction with Microprose, because they wanted to have something that would compete with Sid Meier's Civilization, which we thought was a bit ambitious, of course. So they gave us some sort of requirements. One was that it had to have like some kind of Civilopedia equivalent, and it needed to have some kind of research tree, and it needed to be set on Earth. And the theme they chose was UFOs. A bunch of guys there were fans of the Jerry Anderson show, which was called UFO. And actually from that show, we took the idea of the XCOM organization, because in the show you had an organization called Shadow, and their job was to intercept UFOs. They had 3 levels of interception. One was based on the moon, so they had moon-based interceptors. Then they had sort of aircraft, air-based interceptions. And finally, if the UFO made it all the way down to the ground, they had a ground-based interceptor. We didn't have the moon-based interceptions in XCOM, but we did have this idea that you could intercept UFOs in the air and on the ground, and we had this organization like Shadow, which became XCOM. So that is actually how XCOM got started, and we would I had to basically design a sort of strategic layer to incorporate this tactical layer, which we already developed, and was an evolution of Laser Squad and my earlier games. That's how it came about.
Was that a big challenge, or was that a fairly simple affair?
It was a big challenge. In terms of the design, I produced a little design document, which is not very long, 12 pages. It had all the elements there, but there wasn't very much explanation how it all works. And the Microprose UK designers were also a bit puzzled as to how it was supposed to work, and it took a lot of convincing. And in fact, this sort of interaction between the strategic and tactical layer never really came together very well, and probably until the last 3 or 4 months of development of the actual game itself. And it was just me and Nick, my brother, who were working on the game in terms of programming and design, and we had a couple of artists who were based at Microprose who were contributing the art for it. So it was a very, very small team by today's standards. And it was a very ambitious game for such a small team. And yeah, it was challenging. And there was a lot of code in the game. We actually had to split the game into 2 separate executables. So you got the strategic level, the Geoscape was called geoscape.exe, and that would have to load up the tactical game, which is called the battlescape.exe. And then when the battle was finished, it had to load up the geoscape.exe. That's how we managed to fit the stuff within the memory requirements.
That's interesting. Though I think it did ultimately work out very well, because the multi-layered gameplay is one of the more unique and interesting things about XCOM.
Yeah, I would agree. Absolutely. I mean, it completely transformed what could have been just a sequence of tactical missions into something much, much, much more interesting.
All right. So, did you ever foresee that this game? Well, first of all, this wasn't actually called XCOM at first, right? It was
No.
UFO Enemy Unknown.
That's right, yeah. I mean, initially we just called it UFO, and the European version was released as UFO Enemy Unknown. They switched the name for the US release, which came, I think, a few months after, about 4 months after the European release. They switched the name to XCOM UFO Defense, which is probably was a good move, because UFO as a title was a bit generic, and XCOM was something. The actual name XCOM was invented by the two designers at Microprose UK. One of whom was Steve Hand, who was a major influence in actually getting the game signed by Microprose. So they'd actually invented the name for this organization, and that became the name of the game for the US release. And XCOM sort of stands for Extraterrestrial Combat Force or something like that.
I was wondering if it was like Extraterrestrial Command or something like that.
Yeah, well, the way it was a bit vague as to what it actually meant, but yeah, Extraterrestrial Combat Force was the way Steve Hand put it. So
makes sense.
Yeah. Command also makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, did you think that the game you were making would take off as it did? Like,
no, we had absolutely no idea what the reaction to it would be, because there's no other game like it at the time. I mean, it's completely an unknown quantity. Obviously, some of the early sort of two-player sort of tactical skirmish games that I've done have been quite popular in the past. You know, the Laser Squad was popular. All we came back to Rebel Star Raiders was popular, so we knew that that side would kind of work quite well. But yeah, it was a really unknown quantity. We were not convinced. We had no idea. I mean, Microprose UK were quietly confident that it would do pretty well, and indeed it did. So they were right.
Right. So I know you developed at least one of the follow-ups.
Yes.
XCOM Apocalypse, I believe.
Yes, correct. Yes.
Yeah. So, what did you do to like expand or improve on the formula, as it were?
Well, an interesting thing was happening in PC gaming at that stage, which did somewhat influence the way XCOM Apocalypse was developed. So around 96, pretty much every game developer in the world was developing RTS games. It was widely seen as pretty much killing off sort of old-fashioned turn-based games. And so XCOM Apocalypse, on the tactical side, we actually had a real-time system for the tactical battles, but it wasn't really much like an RTS in many ways. It was a pausable system, so you could pause the action at any point. You could just hit the space bar, pause the action, and you can actually issue orders in fairly detailed level to your soldiers. And they also had some AI, which was quite useful. So if you put them next to cover, they would actually use it. They would actually duck into cover and out again to shoot automatically. And it had sort of a squad organization system, so you could put guys in squads. It had more sophisticated mechanics all round. Your characters could crawl as well as kneel and stand and so on. It had different armor for different body parts. You can mix and match different types of armor and stuff. It was also quite interesting. One thing we did on the strategic level, which was very different in XCOM Apocalypse, was it set basically in a big city. And this city was controlled by different organizations. Many of these were corporations. Some of them were criminal gangs, religious cults, and they all had a kind of uneasy relationship with each other. And you, as the XCOM organization, also had a sort of diplomatic status with each of these organizations. And if you pissed them off, they would get angry at you. And if you pissed off one of the arms suppliers, they'd stop selling you stuff like that. And it was kind of cool in some ways to watch three-way battles between you, the police force, and the aliens. The police, they don't like the aliens in XCOM, and you as XCOM don't like the aliens, but have to fight the police and so on. So it was quite a departure from the original in the series, but we kind of wanted to do something a bit different, and it was a bit too different, probably. And yeah, the influence of the RTS craze was there. and the fact that we had the real-time tactical combat. Although you could actually play it turn-based as well. You had the choice. You can play in turn-based mode or real-time mode. Although, to be honest, it was designed really for the real-time mode. The turn-based mode didn't work brilliantly. So that was XCOM Apocalypse, and it was released in 1997. So it's pretty much the sort of heyday of RCS gaming at that point. I think it was like 50 or 100 of them released in that year alone. It was getting ridiculous. So after that, you could probably say the XCOM franchise seriously started to go off the rails, but we weren't involved in XCOM after that point.
Is there any particular reason that caused the split, or was it a variety of factors?
Any reason that what?
Was there any particular reason why you no longer made XCOM games, or was it a variety of factors?
Well, actually, what we did during the development of XCOM was that we started thinking about maybe looking for another publisher, because Microprose had gone through quite a few turbulent changes. They were sold to I can't remember the name of the company now.
I think if we're talking
Spectrum Holobyte, sorry, yeah, Spectrum Holobyte. They were sold to Spectrum Holobyte, which mainly specialized in sort of aircraft simulation stuff. And they were very nervous about who actually owns the intellectual property of XCOM. And our legal advice was that probably Microprose did, but obviously their legal advice said that we might have some rights in there. So they tried to force us to officially hand over all rights in XCOM. And they sort of were basically threatening to cancel XCOM Apocalypse if they didn't get their way, and which wasn't very nice from our point of view. We gave them what they wanted in return for some higher royalties on XCOM Apocalypse, but by that point we thought, well, we need to find another publisher. So we actually got a very good offer from Virgin Interactive at that time. So that's why we left, and we can no longer officially work on XCOM, of course, so that's the downside. But by that stage, I think we really wanted to do something different.
Mm-hmm. Understandable. So we do have to press forward, but before we depart from XCOM, I want to know what your thoughts are on the the recent titles under 2K and Firaxis Games.
Well, I think what they attempted to do, and attempted to do amazingly successful, was not just resurrect the XCOM franchise, but actually make turn-based tactical gaming cool again, which is an amazing feat. So I was very, very impressed with what they did. And obviously they made a few changes. A compromise too far, maybe for many XCOM fans, but they actually managed to reach a really big audience with the XCOM Enemy Unknown back in, when was it released? 2012. So I think that was amazing. They did a very good job. XCOM 2, I'm currently playing XCOM 2 with the War of the Chosen expansion, and I think again it's quite amazing what they did. Some things I would have done differently for sure, but there's no denying the fact that XCOM is back again.
That's true. It's true, and in a strategy form, because they also tried to do third-person shooter, the Bureau XCOM Classified.
That's right, yes, yeah. And actually when that was announced, I think it was back in 2010, I was very disappointed, and I I had the urge to try and get a team together and do a proper XCOM remake, and I actually made a little bit of headway in that. But then when Firaxis announced their version of XCOM, I thought, well, there's no point in me trying to do it, because if anyone could do it well, it would almost certainly be Firaxis.
But that's a good jumping off point to Phoenix Point.
So I think we might have to have you back on, because I do have some questions about XCOM, but it would take up the whole show if we did that. So
yeah, we're also skipping a big chunk of its history here. We're jumping from 2001-ish to today.
Yeah.
But we only have an hour, and we've already expended half of that.
Right.
So, and speaking of which, Petty Fan, we do have quite a large cut of gameplay to showcase today.
Yeah, it's going to be rolling on mute in the background.
Yeah, so if you're watching the video version of this, you can watch that. Granted, we've been having some problems with the audio versions of our episodes, but that's a thing for another day. Anyway, so did that desire to make a new XCOM flow into your current project here, Phoenix Point?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you could call it unfinished business in a way. There are some things that I wanted to explore with what it was doing back in XCOM Apocalypse that I wanted to come back to in a much bigger way. And I also wanted to address some of my frustrations with the Firaxis XCOMs on the strategic side by doing something which is more what I wanted to do, I think, with XCOM Apocalypse, which is have a very dynamic and sort of systems-driven world where you as the player are an actor in that world, but you're not. If you did nothing, that world would still continue to do things. Things would happen. Things would resolve in certain ways. So I guess you could call it a bit more of like a simulation style approach to the game. And obviously, the trick with doing anything which is simulation is how do you guarantee that it's going to be fun or interesting for the player? So that's one of the challenges also for Phoenix Point. So what happens in Phoenix Point? Again, it's set on the Earth, and again, there's an alien threat. Although this time it's a very unusual one because it originates from something very basic like a virus and rapidly mutates and starts to take over humans and make monsters out of them. There's a strong Lovecraft influence in both the theme and the storyline, which I can't divulge too much of, but it's certainly based on some of Lovecraft's themes about mutation and combinations of different species, and his obsession with creatures from the sea also comes into Phoenix Point because the aliens of Phoenix Point really emerge from the sea. So I'm exploring a lot of those themes, which are basically the tone is a bit more sci-fi horror than the tone of the modern Firaxis XCOMs. And again, on the strategic side, it's driven by these interactions, not just between you, the player, and the aliens, but these other factions that exist in the world, which have their own agenda and they're doing their own stuff, and they've got their own secrets. They've got their own technology, and you need to get some stuff from them one way or another by either allying with them, or fighting them, or trading with them.
And what made you want to go in a more Lovecraftian direction?
Well, because I really like some of Lovecraft's sort of science fiction-y horror stuff, which is I like the creepy aspect of think there are these vast unknown powers which, if we knew or really understood them, then we'd probably go insane because human beings are just completely unable to comprehend what they are. So I kind of been wanting to put some of that stuff in some of that's already actually in XCOM Apocalypse at a certain level, although it didn't really succeed very well. And actually, after doing the first XCOM, I wanted to do a sort of Lovecraftian style XCOM game set in the 1930s with secret sort of religious cults and interdimensional monsters and so on. But Microprose didn't like that because they told us that horror games don't sell. So anyway, these themes I'd always wanted to explore, and I wanted to come back to them with Phoenix Point. Now, Phoenix Point is set in the future, so the game itself starts in like the year 2047, but the actual sort of pandemic, which starts the alien evolution, is sort of set in the very near future, and there's a whole history of what happens up to the point the game actually starts. And it's a much more developed and intricate world in terms of the world building. It's something I really want to explore, and I've got two excellent writers in our writing team who are working on this, which is Jonas Kaidatsis, who worked on Talos Principle, Alan Stroud, who also worked with us on our previous project, which is Chaos Reborn, and he's also worked with the Elite Dangerous team on novelization there. So we have much more intricate world building, and the game itself on the Geoscape level also has a more it's going a little bit more towards the very original XCOM, where you've got the aliens are doing stuff. The aliens are doing stuff, but they are they're working to their own agenda, and you have to try and figure out what that is and try and upset their plans. And in Phoenix Point, you've not only got the aliens working to their agenda, you've got these other factions working to their agendas, and there's more interesting sort of dynamics there between things that happen between them, and more interesting outcomes for the player.
Right. So outside of the horror theme, what will distinguish this game from the modern XCOM series in terms of like mechanics and stuff?
Right. So the mechanics. So we still have turn-based tactical battles, but one of the main several mechanics that are fundamentally different. So one of the main ones is the fact that we use this like will points system. So obviously you've got movement points, and you've got L points, and you've got will points. And will points are used to spend on physically or mentally stressful actions. Some of these can be really powerful, but the only way you can do these powerful actions is by actually spending those will points, and will points can be forced down below like 0, which can cause your soldiers to panic. So you take a risk, obviously, by doing these actions. But there are ways to mitigate that. So the will point mechanic is quite a strong one, and it allows characters to do some powerful combinations during a turn rather than just a straightforward move and shoot. They can do more, and so that's an interesting dynamic game. The other thing is that we have probably more sophisticated damage systems, so we've got more realistic ballistics in terms of how the weapons work, and body parts, so hit location stuff. So different body parts have different abilities and armor levels and different effects when you injure them. This is very important when you're fighting the aliens, by the way, because an important part of your strategy will be to try and identify and take advantage of the weak spots on aliens, especially the large monsters. So the third thing, which is majorly different, is that we do have some really large-scale enemies, and in the tactical battles, these can be really big, like as big as a house. And again, you have to decide which parts of the body you're attacking, not just shoot at this monster, because it makes a difference which hit location you're going for. And they have some very interesting combinations of abilities as well. And then even bigger scale on a strategic level, we have these behemoths, which are skyscraper-sized monsters, which are roaming the landscape at later stages of the game. And you have to, the way to take those out is you have to actually land a squad on top of them and deploy sort of automated drills with poison on them to actually take them down, because they're extremely heavily armored. So we have some really interesting sort of senses of scale there. I just wanted to get this idea that you as a squad were fighting just these incredibly threatening and large monsters.
Yeah, if you're watching the video footage we got, you're seeing a campaign against this giant, I don't know, scorpion beast.
Yes, so this is one of the monsters. And also, I think we can add another thing in there, which I didn't really mention there, but I did briefly describe how the aliens are sort of evolving and mutating. So one thing that happens is that the enemies that you fight on the battlefield will, next time you face them, they may have mutated. And that mutation may be subtle, but it might introduce some interesting new ability. They might develop ability to spit poison, or they might the monster might develop an ability to emit the mist, which shrouds them and sort of cover and so on. So these mutations will occur when you defeat the aliens in a certain way, and they will adapt. So basically, depending on how you play as a player, and also on a number of random factors, you will probably face quite different enemies from one game to the next.
Is that procedurally generated?
Yeah, partially. Though the aliens are built from pre-configured components, there are procedural systems also involved which give different emphasis to different abilities and attributes, and this is reflected visually in the creatures as well.
Neat. And is that just to the monsters, or like the arenas, or the locations procedurally generated as well?
Yeah, the locations are procedurally generated in a similar way to XCOM 2, or even the original XCOM, come to think of it. And there's a lot of procedural generation, of course, in the strategic side setup as well. So it'll never start off exactly the same. And one game you might encounter one of the factions early on, and another game it might be a different one encounter early on, and that could affect the course of your development and which way you're going, what technology you get access to, and so on.
Sounds good. Keeps things fresh.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, we have a question from the chat. Spoiler Kevin asks, have you spoken with Dave Ellis since the split?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I spoke to Dave when I was doing a presentation on sort of classic postmortem. This is a talk that I did at the Game Developers Conference back in about 4 years ago. I spoke to him at length about his experience on XCOM, because Dave Ellis did the original strategy guide for XCOM, and then he went on to work on XCOM, the Space Sim one, can't remember what it's called now, and also he worked on XCOM Genesis, which was a cancelled project, which was supposed to be a sort of reimagining of the original XCOM. Yeah, so I spoke to him at length about what happened in his experience with it, and I guess we were of actually both he and I share exactly the same birthday, which is interesting. So we always have a mutual birthday celebration. Yeah, so there were many attempts actually in those days to sort of revive or rejuvenate the XCOM franchise. There was XCOM Genesis, which Dave Ellis was working on. There was also a big game called XCOM Alliance, which originally started development in UK Microprose and then was transferred to the US. That was cancelled as well, actually. So there you go.
That's good to hear that everything's been worked out and patched up. Anyway, let's see. Unstable Voltage asks about Interceptor.
Yes, Interceptor. This was the game which Dave Ellis designed. And obviously replaced the tactical battles with a sort of fairly arcadey style space sim thing, which didn't go down very well with XCOM players. It was too far removed from what XCOM was all about, of course.
Right. So, bringing it back to the beginning of the interview, how are you integrating your experiments with AI into Phoenix Point here?
Well, the AI again is based on the mutation evolution system. So the actual behaviors and tactics used by the aliens will change as they mutate and as they gain different abilities. There's also a strategic level AI as well. So there's a lot more going on than just on the tactical level. In particular, the independent human factions have a strategic AI which governs their haven, their base building, their technological. They each have their own tech trees, for example, and also their diplomatic initiatives. They will make alliances with each other, or they have wars with each other. This will also happen. So yeah, there's a lot more going on in terms of AI in Phoenix Point than what there has been in any previous XCOM style game, for sure.
Interesting. And War Too Good asks, wouldn't it be cooler to go inside a behemoth and blow up its heart or something like that to kill them? Like,
yeah, it sounds. I don't know. I mean, from the plausibility point of view, I guess, even though large monsters don't really exist, I'm not sure they will have convenient corridors for you to navigate through. Yeah, but that's an interesting idea. Maybe you do literally have to dig a route to its heart. That might be an alternative way to take them down. But the basic way was that the behemoths themselves are protected by little minions that are all over its body, so you will certainly have plenty of fighting to do in order to beat them.
Right, and in terms of middleware solutions, is this game being done in Unreal or Unity or another engine?
We're using Unity, which is we used Unity for our previous projects, Chaos Reborn, and we liked it, and we're sticking with it. It has a number of advantages, particularly on the programming side, uses C#, which is a .NET-based system. Makes it much easier to debug and program. Graphically, it's pretty comparable to Unreal, I guess. Both engines are very, very good, by the way. I mean, I really can't say. Obviously, they're trying to compete with each other directly, so obviously there's a lot of similarities between them. I think Unity does get a bad reputation because of all the terrible sort of cheap games that are made with it, but that doesn't actually mean the engine itself is bad at all. So yeah, we're impressed with it, and that's what we're using.
Well, it's one of the ways. The other way is in performance.
Yeah.
Like a lot of optimization. Oh geez, we've had so many developers complain about optimizing their games in Unity, especially if they're doing console versions.
Console versions are tricky. For sure, there was definitely a problem with especially the Xbox One version of Unity, but they've made some very big improvements in that over the last year or so. I think implementing any console game is pretty tricky because you've got these very tight constraints, which are not really there on the PC, or at least more flexible on the PC. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, most of our backers, most of our players are all pretty much hardcore PC gamers. Right. But we'll see.
Yeah, I kind of figured that this game was being targeted for a PC release primarily.
Yeah.
Given the, given the depth and complexity on display here.
Yeah.
I mean, that is something that people have claimed hobbled the modern XCOM games. The fact that they did develop it in tandem with consoles. but that's not.
Yeah, that is an argument. Yeah, people say that it's dumbed down. I don't really buy that because the game is certainly more accessible and easy to play for a console player, for sure. But there's still a lot of interesting strategies, especially with their expansion. They did the Enemy Within, and XCOM 2 also has, on a tactical level, XCOM 2 is way more sophisticated than the original XCOM ever was.
Right. It's a whole thing that's it's pretty silly, if I'm being honest, for the most part. But there are merits to the discussion because consoles have bottlenecks and all that stuff, and they're not as flexible as PCs and so on and so forth. But anyway, we have another question from the chat. Vager asks, if NPC factions have their own research trees, does that mean they get new technologies just like the player does by conducting actual research and unlocking new stuff based on available resources, scientists, etc.? Or do they cheat, quote unquote, and are more level scaled, quote unquote, according to how much time has passed in game or how advanced the Phoenix project is?
No, they don't cheat. There's no sort of level scaling mechanic there. The factions have to conform to the same rules, so they need to acquire resources, they need to build facilities, they need to build laboratories and workshops, they need to do the research over time, they need to have the scientists and engineers, and they need to do all that. Yes.
No, I have kind of a side question to that.
Mhm.
Will the player be able to interfere or assist with factions they don't like or do like?
Yes, absolutely. So if you ally with a faction, you have both benefits and obligations. So the benefits are that you will get to share their research. What research they do, you will get. The obligations are that you have to assist them defending their havens, and you have to share some of the things that you discover as well. Now, the interesting thing in the game is that each of these factions has their own potential solution to the alien problem, but they have to get there. So you can help them directly get to their solution, and that gives you a win for the game. Or if on acquiring their solution to the alien problem, you can then implement it yourself. You can literally steal their secrets and information and then implement their solution. So all these things are possible.
So how long would a regular session of Phoenix Point last in terms of gameplay?
Are you talking about a whole campaign or what?
Say a battle and campaign.
Oh, battle. So the battles are very similar, I guess, in scope to XCOM 2. Mm-hmm. Some of them will be bigger though. So, for example, if your base comes under attack, you will be able to deploy all your forces that you've got there. So that could definitely result in a big battle. The other battles are also potentially bigger once you develop larger craft to carry more people. This is somehow it's a little bit similar to the way it works in the original XCOM. Otherwise, you will probably face many smaller battles, which are literally skirmishes where you're scavenging for resources or doing standard haven defense. There are also other types of battles which are, assassinations, sabotage, stealing, taking over a haven, which is like a coup or counter-coup attempts. So there's some interesting variety there.
And can you say anything on multiplayer at this point?
No, we are not supporting multiplayer in the initial release of Phoenix Point. Essentially because very few of our backers really wanted it. It wasn't that important to them. So we're not going to implement it, at least not for the initial release.
Okay. Like, sounds like that's something that might come down the line afterwards.
Yeah, potentially, yes.
Okay. Let's see. Another question. Will the game be on Steam, other digital storefronts, or a straight release?
It will be on Steam and GOG. Sure.
Right, and is this game being developed only for Windows, or is there going to be a Mac and Linux version?
We are going to do a Mac and Linux version. Unity supports it quite well. We aim to have the Mac and Linux version completely ready for the PC release. So the answer is yes.
That's always good to hear. It's like the answer gets quite varied, especially the Linux version.
Yeah, there are issues. I mean, for our previous project, Chaos Reborn, we did support Mac and Linux. Linux does tend to cause problems, for sure. And it's actually impossible to solve everybody's problem unless they're using a relatively well-supported version of Linux and well-supported by Unity, that is. So, yeah, I mean, it can be problematic, but we managed to do reasonably well with Chaos Reborn.
That's good to hear. So, are there any details on potential release or price point at this point?
So our target release date is the end of next year, and the price point, we haven't decided on the final price point. It's almost certainly likely to be higher than what the pre-order price is. At the moment, pre-order price for our base version is $30. So it probably will be higher than that when we get to release. But for now, actually on our store, pre-order store, it's $30.
Is the game in early access?
Not yet. We will be releasing an initial sort of version to our backers who've bought the sort of second tier of our, the digital luxury edition, which gives you early access, very, very early access. And those backers will be able to get access to it by the end of March next year. And we will continue making releases to backers up to the main release, which will be on Steam.
Good to hear. All right, I'll see if my colleagues have any final questions for you.
I think all of my questions were answered.
I probably have quite a few, but we don't have a ton of time. So.
Indeed. But we might have you on again when the game reaches a more complete state of release.
It will be my pleasure.
Oh, good to hear. Good to hear. All right, so the game is Phoenix Point. You can pre-order at phoenixpoint.info. It's $30 right now. It'll be $50 come release. And yeah, I'm looking forward to playing this myself.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, hopefully we can review it for the show. Anyway, so that'll about do it for this installment of Fragments of Silicon. As far as tomorrow's episode goes, sorry, Flemmy. Oh, there we go. As far as tomorrow's episode goes, it's going to be a double topic. It's going to be a double topic. If I'm feeling up to it, I'm like, we didn't secure a guest in time for this, and we're also having an issue with next week's Wednesday guest. Can't go into it right now, but they might have to delay their appearance next week. Don't know. Just kind of in limbo there, so it just might be Petty Fans streaming tomorrow. But on that note, we hope you enjoyed this presentation of ours, and you'll be with us tomorrow, whatever we have presented. And until then, I wish you good gaming.